and it's a privilege to be able to address all of you. The investments that we have collectively as a society in your institutions are truly our future, and they're the only opportunity we have to pave and to create an infrastructure of extraordinary young people who will be the pathway to our future. The thesis, I think, of this presentation is that there are many parallels in our industries, and the challenges that we face are quite similar. What I'll try to present to you are the challenges that we have been facing or are in the process of facing in healthcare, some of the parallels that there are, particularly in higher education, and some of the strategy that we're using at Partners that may in fact inform some of the direction that might in fact be helpful to you as we move forward. Needless to say, the federal government, who sponsors much of the work that we all do in this room, that we collectively do in academia as well as in healthcare delivery, is facing interesting and challenging moments. And needless to say as well, the proportion of the problems that the federal government faces that are contributed to by the way that we deliver healthcare in this country are important. And they are critical. And they become more intense as we've just passed through the most important downturn in the American economy since the Great Depression. So if one looks at a federal deficit that's approaching 17 or in the range of $17 trillion, healthcare through the growth of Medicare and Medicaid is clearly crowding out much of the way of other opportunity. There isn't one of us who doesn't live in a community that hasn't laid off teachers or firemen or made reductions in investments in overall infrastructure because of increased healthcare premiums that are associated with supporting the healthcare benefits of municipal workers or retirees. And from a mission-generated or mission-oriented organization, this is for us really refuting our own mission. How is it that we are to invest in our communities and our own future if in fact our own behavior is not considered to be adequately responsible to be embracing the greater good of the communities that we serve? On the private sector side, healthcare premiums are crowding out wages and they're crowding out capital overall as the growth of healthcare premiums overall is exceeding the growth of a general economy on the private sector side as well. And in healthcare, we see a future in which these demands are likely to grow overall. For the next 20 years, as the baby boom generation ages, we will see dramatic changes in the demand for healthcare overall. Every day for the next 20 years, about 10,000 baby boomers will achieve older age. And if you think about the overall dependency ratio, at the beginning of the last decade, there were about one person between the ages of 18 and 65, people who were, there were about 8 people between the ages of 18 and 65 for every one person below 18 and every person who is over the age of 65. That will reduce to about 1 in 4 in about 15 years. So that change in the so-called dependency ratio creates substantial stress on the ability to pay for these changes overall. And as you look at that older adult population, what one sees is really the growth in a remarkable way of chronic conditions. The number of people with chronic diseases that come about in 2 different ways. One is the safe aging of older adult populations, and the second is our conversion of many acute phenomena that have short life expectancy associated with them to chronic diseases. We've made many cancers into chronic illnesses, and a lot of the increased treatment of cancer relates not just to diagnostic efficiency and effectiveness, but to our treating cancers a second and third time as people are able to live through principal episodes overall. So this creates a massive stress overall. From a healthcare policy perspective, clearly society is not able to sustain increased healthcare cost growth. There isn't an opportunity that any one of us has to pick up a newspaper or to listen to a radio or television or pay a little bit of attention to some of the debate that was going on in the federal government, if that's what one can call it, over the course of the last few weeks, and not hear healthcare being the major cause. It is clearly associated with the growth in the federal deficit. Every state budget in the country has its single most important line item, its Medicaid budget. A number of states have chosen not to expand Medicaid, despite the overall focus through the Affordable Care Act to try to extend coverage overall. And for every employer, growth in healthcare coverage overall and the costs of health insurance are making their choices more and more difficult. Each municipal budget is squeezed and the political pressure is clearly to act. But I don't think we're alone in this. And this isn't really a slide to defend us, but it seems like misery loves company. And that's why I agreed when Charlie asked me to give this talk to be in the room with all of you. Because this scrutiny, as you can see, we finally found something that outstrips healthcare cost growth as it relates to GDP and household income, and you guys can own that together with us. And clearly, as one looks at education, healthcare, and the rest of the budget overall, the growth of our two items are outstripping the rest of the economy. And if these are two critical components, if these are the civil rights of our time, if the social justice will be defined in who has a pathway to fabulous education at the K through 12 level, who has the pathway to be able to have tremendous higher education and the skills that are necessary in the knowledge economy we face, and who is it that has a right and not a privilege to superb health care. It'll be defined by these two elements, but we as leaders need to think about how we use those resources in a way that defines ourselves with a higher degree of accountability, as Helen was describing. So there are a number of parallels and a number of areas in which the Venn diagram crosses over pretty extensively here. We both have substantial and multifaceted missions. There isn't one of us who isn't running a complex organization that has substantial matrix tensions, the educational and research components that you, as well as the operational components that you're responsible for. For us, they're somewhat broader because they also include the delivery of healthcare and our investments in our communities. Obviously, the higher proportion of our consumption of GDP and the fact that we're outstripping the rest of the economy is imperiling the ability to fund the work that we do overall. In general, however, some of this has happened because there are third and fourth parties that are involved overall that reduces overall price sensitivity. One couldn't have imagined that private tuition should be $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 overall if one thought about the overall supply and demand side with substantial, what appears to be infinite elasticity in terms of price. And in healthcare, that's exaggerated by insurance. The protection of individual consumers from overall prices has created price distortions in healthcare over the course of about the last 3.5 generations. And that's increased with every insurance opportunity we've created. It increased remarkably when we moved from just private insurance to Medicare and Medicaid in the 1960s, and it'll increase even more as we have overall expansion, unless there are changes overall to the insurance process. Just think about it. You have obviously scholarships, grants, work-study programs, Pell Grants, and a variety of other elements that really defer the cost in a way that reduces overall sensitivity in terms of prices. Probably not as extreme as it is in healthcare, where transactional costs are really not understood and they rarely come onto the balance sheet of an individual, but nonetheless, those price sensitivities create very, very substantial distortions in how it is that we use capital, in the services that we provide, and in our willingness to expand our income statements. And that is a major an overall major challenge and a major similarity. The second is that both of us have been charities. Healthcare institutions in this country have been dominated by not-for-profits and a not-for-profit system that moved across the country, and science and healthcare delivery moved together in the urban capitalization of healthcare in the United States, really from the moment of epidemics in the 19th century to the capitalization and broader base of the Health Services Administration Act and the growth of the NIH throughout the country. So we have an opportunity, we've had incentives, both of us, to use lots of capital, to have access to a different set of capital markets, to essentially be able to arbitrage municipal bond funds, as well as to get contributions from government and private individuals that have tax benefits that are associated with them. Additionally, they've created different incentives for us. And I think from a mission perspective, very positive incentives. Our incentives are long-run incentives. While we're criticized by our much more effective partners in business, and as a member of the Fed board, I won't say some of those businesses haven't been that effective overall in regulating themselves either. But that being said, we've taken a longer run approach. We're not sitting quarterly profit statement to quarterly profit statement expecting stock price or equity value to change. We're looking at the investments we can make in communities, we can make in changing the way that our young people receive education, or in our approaches to healthcare that have a much longer time horizon, a different demand cycle, and our fiduciaries of the public, and our community volunteer boards, which are very, very different than equity holders who sit on those boards. That being said, they have also created different kinds of demand for innovation, different kinds of demand as it relates to accountability, and different kinds of demand as it relates to accountability and innovation overall. The funding challenges in healthcare and in higher education are quite similar. We basically are sitting with federal and state direct payments and some municipality direct payments overall. There are subsidies to the payments that come from those who consume our resources, and subsidies that come to our operations overall. We both use our balance sheets to be able to leverage the work that we do to varying degrees in this room, the endowment earnings that you might have, the fundraising that you use either directly for building infrastructure or to be able to leverage that infrastructure in the long run has variable returns associated with it, often difficult to predict over a period of time, making expenditures somewhat risky, and when there's a shock to the system, extraordinarily risky. And the higher that your endowments are dependent on in your income statement, and I know many universities and colleges may have 10, 20, 30, 40% of their overall operating budget sitting off of endowments. Those create a much higher risk play. And additionally, philanthropy. We spend lots of our times as leaders trying to tell the story of what we do, trying to seduce others, sometimes following their pathways a little bit more than our own business plans in the new products that we create, in the new work that we do, and in the new infrastructure that we build. An interesting conundrum and a challenging one. It's a different story to tell when one is trying to really sell the work that we're doing and try to move it forward to our students, to our patients, and to those who judge our science than it is sitting in Palm Beach and trying to figure out how it is that one tells a story in a way that appeals to an individual who might make a major gift. The other is that we are all, some way or another, in the research business. Even the smallest of the colleges in the room are all about expanding knowledge, and the vast diversity of resources are challenged. Those on the federal side, which are the largest, are most challenged by the issues that I described before, but those on the foundation side really vary with overall returns in the marketplace and the interests of foundations, which may change day to day. And on the corporate side, guiding science based upon the corporate need overall of corporate partnerships can be challenging because it narrows the direction of that science, moves us away from science for science perspective. And obviously the financial challenges can cause financial peril in the balance sheets of all of our institutions. If our bonds are downgraded, our ability to attain debt in an ongoing way becomes diminished as well. The issue also is, how is it that we measure value? What are the outcome measures? How is it that society holds us accountable, and what's the product outcome? What does a degree mean overall in any of the institutions in this room? And for us, what is it that we're trying to deliver in terms of healthcare that is measurable and differentiatable? I can tell you that in health services research, we've done an awful job in being able to measure outcomes associated with the clinical inputs in a way that are sensitive enough to differentiate providers. And many of the overall ratings that all of us dependent upon are arbitrary, capricious, and reputational in nature. We all, as many people in this room, look at U.S. News and World Report as people on the healthcare side, and that being of value to consumers without necessarily being grounded in actual differentiation among any of us as providers is real in both of our industries and is critically important. Increasingly, on the education side, you are being asked to demonstrate some outcome relative to some unit of cost, as we are. The notion of measuring value. Is it degrees for tuition? Is it specific skill sets that are associated with work outcomes that are associated with the inputs that you create? They haven't really been measured. They haven't certainly been studied in a way that people have great pride associated with them, but policymakers are starting to cling to them even in the absence of their quality. And you can go online and see 15 different ways of measuring the quality of doctors, 25 different ways of looking at hospitals. Most of them are process measures to see if we're adhering to protocols, not whether we have outcomes that differentiate ourselves for specific inputs. The same thing goes for colleges and other institutions of higher education. The other is a real and overall indictment of the work that we do from the perspective of how we face the market. Because of the infinite elasticity in terms of price, overall, what has appeared and felt like over the last decade to be enormous availability of resources without any top to them and continuous inflation despite a constricting economy, there is the question of what is it that we're inducing to create greater expense. On the healthcare side, the whole notion of fee-for-service medicine is under scrutiny and suggesting that anybody who has a shingle, hangs that shingle, automatically has a business. And therefore, doctors and hospitals are incented once they create a facility to use it. And the same thing as it relates to the way in which one approaches students, trying to fill classes, and trying to create multiple different kinds of products to use the educational fixed cost substrates that you create overall. And all of us are being indicted one way or the other, both directly as well as in a broader term by society, by the growth of our overhead, by the number of us who sit in the room, by the infrastructure that we've created in our environments, by the capital that we've appeared to have overinvested without necessarily being able to demonstrate incremental outputs overall. Now there are calls on the higher education side for changes in payment, paying for performance or paying for outcomes, changing the overall tuition infrastructure, and as there have been in healthcare. For healthcare to be able to move from a system that focuses on fee-for-service medicine to prepayment, and at the same time to look at disruptive players in the marketplace, with for-profits moving into the market and innovative solutions, distance medicine, as well as distance education being those disruptions. So for us, Partners is a substantial and large system. Actually, this year's budget that just ended was about $11 billion. There are about 60,600 employees. We have a research budget of about $1.5 billion of extramural funding. And as you can see, we have thousands of trainees at various levels, and we're the major teaching hospitals on the medical school side for Harvard Medical School, as well as for a number of the institutions here for providers of other disciplines. We have been at the center of this discussion, whether we've liked it or not, and have been, to some extent, cited as being the blame for higher healthcare costs in this marketplace, and have had to tell our story in a way that's clearer to the marketplace overall. But our mission, like yours, is a multifaceted one. It is to bring the best and the brightest people to care for the sickest and neediest among us. It's to use discovery to be able to improve that care, and to use care to broaden that discovery and to broaden science, to train those people who are the future in our system. That has been our leverage for 200 years, like all of you, being magnets for magnificent young people. And it's to invest in our communities and to take care of those neediest populations, whether they're in Dorchester, Mission Hill, Charlestown, Revere, or Chelsea, or Rwanda, Lesotho, Malawi, or Durban, South Africa. And so from a strategic perspective, the question is, how do we preserve that mission? How do we become more accountable and create a sense of efficiency? How do we tell that story in a real way? And how do we embrace approaches that create a catalyst for transition from a fee-for-service environment, which has been growing in a way that we haven't controlled without accountability or outcomes that we can demonstrate to the public? And you have seen three major ways that society's been trying to focus on us, and I think that they aren't far different from what society could do on the educational side. One is to basically control our rates, or control salaries, or control our costs, or create ceilings on them as they relate to the way that we're paid overall. The second is to have some kind of payment reform. For us, it's being able to share risk and to be able to demonstrate outcomes that then create bonuses in the way that we provide care overall. But any number of reforms have been proposed overall on the educational side. And the third is to start to reduce the overall dependence on other forms of payment, and to have consumers having more skin in the game. And in healthcare, as you see as employers, it's having more copays and deductibles, creating tiered networks, and having a higher degree of transparency as it relates to price, and having basically those consumers have to spend more out of pocket related to using higher providers or having less access to those services. From a strategic perspective, we've said we have to control our own destiny in this regard. We cannot sit and let payers or government alone control that destiny. We have to take responsibility for demonstrating those outcomes and be able to preserve our mission as we do so. And the notion is to try to demonstrate that as we reduce costs overall, we can increase value, that we can reorganize the care that we're providing so that we can have a higher degree of coordination of the resources that we have, so we can leverage the investments we've made in community hospitals, in in-home services, in telehealth, as well as in the academic medical centers, to get the right care in the right place. And we need to lead overall in being able to demonstrate outcomes. And that is move away from outcomes that are just around process measures that show whether or not we've done mammograms or given vaccinations, to being able to show that we can, through much more fundamental outcomes, that we can provide the outcomes that patients want. So if an older adult is in pain, that we can demonstrate not that we can just put a knee in that person, but that we can, in fact, improve that person's ability to enjoy their grandchildren, to improve their quality of life, and to reduce their pain overall, whether or not we put that knee in, and we warranty any of those services for some period of time after we've provided those services. That's a very big deal for us. You know, everybody's talking about readmission rates because they're angry that we get paid again if somebody has an infection or they didn't follow up with their care, and they themselves have more difficulty. For us to be able to have some skin in the game after somebody's been discharged. But the notion that we'll take responsibility for an episode of care from the time of diagnosis to some period long after we've intervened is very, very different. The notion that we'll take care of a population and have up and downside risk with whether that population consumes more resources than they were predicted to consume, and be able to share with the insurance company either the gains from having better outcomes and less utilization, or suffer the consequences if that population consumes more, flips this whole system upside down, as Helen was saying, and it creates a very, very different measure for us. And if we're going to be leaders in preserving that mission, we need to be leaders in talking to those outcomes as well. So over the course of the last couple of years, we've done a number of things. We reopened all of our contracts and gave back increases that were promised to us in rates to the tune of about $345 million over 4 years. We reduced our direct costs by $300 million a year overall, so that as we have those lower rates, we won't start to lose money remarkably. We moved to taking risk contracts to create incentives to redesign all of our primary care practices, so instead of being impossible places for you to get access to, or impossible places for the poorest among us to get access to, you won't have to make a call to my office to get an appointment. Theoretically, there'll be people who will be managing the population overall, knowing the needs and anticipating them, having intensive care managers to manage that sickest population, that 5% who consume 50% of the resources, where care is the worst and most fragmented, to do it in a better and more coordinated way, and to move towards a different set of payments for those episodes that I described before. So now we've moved about 500,000 people into various kinds of contracts like that. The other side is that we have, like most universities, we have very much of an R environment and not an R&D environment. We have really had a very ambivalent relationship with industry. We've done a very poor job of monetizing all of our discovery. I said to you before, we have about $1.5 billion of extramural research funding that is largely through the Mass General, the Brigham, McLean, and Spalding, and we're one of the largest recipients of NIH dollars. In sequestration, we've had a 5% reduction in NIH funding directly. That has a multiplier effect, as all of you know, because all of our grants have 2 or 3% increases built into the salary lines of multi-year grants. So the access to new scientific funding is dramatically affected. But we, like the pharmaceutical industry, have had a failed model. We don't have the ability to take that great discovery, which is rewarded by publication, not necessarily by the generation of cures and a variety of other elements. And we've shunned a real investment in industry-related relationships. And we've have wonderful scientists, but the work of those scientists doesn't rapidly move to being able to help the population overall. We have a magnificent ecosystem here in Massachusetts, and we have the ability to bring together those ventures and take that science and generate better thoughts, translate that science into real cures, and to work together with industry. And that means starting to move from being an R institution to an R&D institution that starts to allow us to diversify the portfolio and reduce some of the dependence we have on some of those extramural sources on philanthropy as well as on foundation funding. So for us, like you, we are sitting with a multifaceted mission. It's a precious, precious mission, and like many of your institutions, it has lasted centuries. It is about some of the basic and most important civil liberties in this society. It is about providing access to excellence in an ongoing way. But the models that we've used up until now clearly have not generated the kind of efficiency or effectiveness that society is asking us to have. The challenge is there, but I believe we're up to it. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take some questions. Yes, sir. So first, you suggest that that's in the past tense. I mean, you know, we are struggling in the same way to create coherence and to have basically data warehouses that allow us to create data marts that are available to scientists, administrators, and managers in a variety of different ways. I think that we started when Partners, shortly after Partners was formed, Eugene Braunwald, who's probably among the most important living physicians, he's kind of the cardiologist who taught us about the importance of oxygenation of cardiac tissue and survival, among other things, was the chief academic officer of Partners. And the first thing he created was a research patient data repository in which all of our clinical data were collected together and put into what ultimately became a phenotypic database describing all the patients that we take care of, and had a commonness of data collection early on. So we've been doing that part of the work for about 16 or 17 years, and increasingly working on the data so that they can be interpreted in relevant ways, but we have so much more work to do to define variables in a way that they can be used across the system in the way that you're describing. Other questions? Well, thank you very, very much. One more question.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank
sure.
you. I'm Lucille Nickerson from the University of Hartford, and as
How are
chair,
you?
I'm sorry.
How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks to your medical profession, and thank you for.
I was asking as a psychiatrist. There was
very, very sustaining. So my question as a board member is, we were talking this morning about gaining acceptance from our different constituencies, including faculty. And can you tell me a little bit about how you succeed in interesting your physicians in accepting the changes that have been happening?
So that's a magnificent question. You know, Partners is a very interesting institution. It's made up of a number of institutions that are very, very powerful organizations to themselves. And one of the critical pieces of our ability to succeed in achieving our mission is to nurture the cultures of the individual institutions that have been successful for so long and not mess them up. And at the same time, be able to make enough change so that we can adapt to a world that's around us. And trying to take the wheat from the chaff to determine what components are culture that are just defending people's current positions and what components are truly necessary is pretty critical. So when we started looking at this, I started as a CEO of Partners about almost 4 years ago. And we started a little bit of a strategic planning process looking at the world that was coming and that was evolving pretty dramatically in the 6 months before I started. And we put together a case for change, kind of describing what was going on in the overall economy, the threat that increased price sensitivity could have overall, the challenges of being able to pay for the critical components of the academic mission, the way in which we're situated into the marketplace, and then use that to build the fundamentals and the pillars of a strategic plan. But I would tell you that we've had to tell that story 100 times. We're going to continue to have to, and then we're going to have to do a lot of retail work with individual leaders of programs, of sections, and of divisions as there is more and more effect over time. I mean, we're getting our toe wet in a transformed environment. When we move into a marketplace that is considerably more price sensitive and with much more substantial reductions on the federal and the health insurance side, which I see over the course about the next 2 or 3 years, the expectations that people have will have to accelerate. The changes that they've been buffered from even during this period of time are going to diminish, and it's going to cause some fragmentation. It's going to be very, very challenging.
My question is, when you spoke at the end of your presentation about the change in the research without the D part and the movement towards connecting to the D part. You mentioned that there was some reluctance to engage with for-profit organizations, and I think we have some of that going on in higher education as well. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on how to make that transition possible.
You know, we have this perception that there is a purism to our discovery, and the notion of sharing intellectual property and discoveries overall is somehow potentially a violation of our overall academic set of principles. At the same time, we believe that our IP has universal, just unlimited value, and that unlimited value should be for us, and the notion of sharing it in any way with those who may have other sets of talents or the ability to invest might be foolhardy. So we've moved to having, I think, contracting ability that angers virtually everyone who sits down at the table with us in a variety of different ways. We've had more legal people working in research, ventures, and licensing than entrepreneurial people. And that's backwards. And it's a signal that we've given despite having a huge amount of a commercial investment in the work that we do. We've really been shunning our own partners over time. At the same time, for a long period of time, we've been confused on the academic side with telling the story of what's research, what's education, and what's marketing. So when we get into trouble, we confuse those pieces. And when our doctors or our scientists mostly do marketing work and essentially take funding for that kind of work as opposed to funding that's related to their science or for educational programs, we become tainted relatively rapidly. And as a result, we've created conflicts rules that have swung the pendulum too far over into the other direction. Well, now that we've shown ourselves to be a little bit cleaner and we've separated those components, we need to move back to a center in which we have a set of entrepreneurial transactions. Because at the end of the day, industry has the exact same objectives that we have. Those who are working in IT to be able to bring education more rapidly to young people and to be able to disseminate the knowledge that your professors are developing in your places have the same set of objectives that you have in nurturing those faculty and nurturing knowledge. The challenge is that everybody wants exclusivity over it, and the same thing relates to the cures for illnesses and the development of devices. And that exclusivity is terribly inefficient, particularly as the infrastructure around these things is so expensive. Building those IT platforms or building sequencing in order to put together genomics, proteomics together with phenotypic data or the data warehouses that we described. We need to share in those investments if there are going to be efficiencies and there's going to be real translation.